I am Peter Starr, Dean of the College of Arts and Sciences, and it's a great pleasure to welcome you on behalf of our Center for Israel Studies officially, although you started last night, to today's conference, Israel Abroad, the Israeli Diaspora, Past and Present. And I want to especially welcome our speakers who've come not just from across the United States, from Israel, India, and Canada. It's obvious, but it has to be said. We at American University decry the events in Pittsburgh on Saturday. We mourn the loss of those 11 wonderful people, and we particularly mourn the loss of a sense of tolerance, compassion, openness that we're seeing not just here in the United States, but around the world. The work of the Center for Israel Studies is part of the solution to that problem, but I will tell you, it is not an easy solution, and it's one that all of us have to fight as hard as we possibly can to erase. Not erase the solution, erase the problem. Anyway, as you may know, AU Center for Israel Studies is the oldest of its kind in the United States, having been inaugurated in 1998 by Shimon Peres. An interdisciplinary center housed in our College of Arts and Sciences, but drawing on faculty from across American University, including several that you will hear from this afternoon. The center offers a broad diversity of Israel Studies classes in many disciplines, leads students on trips to the country, and sponsors many public events, including lectures, art exhibitions, including exhibitions from our Rothschild collection of Israeli art, theater and film performances, and conferences such as this one. Today's is the 6th in a series of academic conferences that the Center has organized over as many years. These have included Israel Studies and Jewish Studies in America, 2013, How Jewish is the Jewish State, Religion and Society in Israel, 2014, Reinventing Israel, Transformation of Israeli Society in the 21st Century, 2015, The Kibbutz, Ideal, Crisis, Renewal, and Israeli Cuisine as a Reflection of Israeli Society last year. As you know, as Israel continues to transform itself, so does our Center for Israel Studies. We pride ourselves of being on the cutting edge of the developments in this relatively recent but burgeoning field. Much has been written, both here in the United States and in Israel, about the Israeli diaspora. We believe, however, that this conference is the first time that scholars and writers from across the discipline has come together to address this theme in a comprehensive way. I was just learned that Boston University will be doing this two months from now, reiterating the pattern whereby American University does something and everyone else follows in this particular space. It's fitting that this conference take place in Washington, D.C., as we are a home to a significant Israeli expat community. And just as Israelis abroad enrich our city, so do they enrich American University's faculty. Let me extend a special thanks to American University's Jewish Studies programs and its director, Pat Midell, over there in the back, for their co-sponsorship of today's conference, and turn the podium over to our director, the director of Center for Israel Studies, Professor of History, Michael Brenner. Thank you. I do want to apologize. I really would love to stay. I have a stack of 35 promotion files waiting for me in my office, and trust me, I would much rather be here listening. Do. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dean Starr, as always, for your support and your kind words, and I know you'd rather stay here. Thank you all for coming from all kinds of the world, from India to Israel and Canada and other parts of the United States, to what indeed seems to be the first gathering on this particular topic. And let me just say a few opening words, and then we'll start with the first panel. So in the history of migration, the return of immigrants into their homeland is actually nothing special, nothing exceptional. According to estimates, about 1/3 of all immigrants to Europe, from Europe, between 1824 and 1924, returned at some point. Immigration and emigration are part of the characteristics of modern states. And still, one might argue, in the case of Israel, maybe it is somewhat different. It, after all, wasn't the Jewish state established in order to gather Jews from all over the world in, the old, new Jewish home. To be sure, the story of immigration to Israel and its absorption is overall an unparalleled success. A story of a small country integrating over the course of decades many more new arrivals than the number of its actual inhabitants were before, providing them with living quarters and jobs and making them full-fledged citizens. This was achieved by a country that was struggling economically during its first decades and at war with its neighbors. But it would be illusionary to believe that, unlike in other countries, in Israel, migration would only go into one direction. In fact, a closer look reveals, and we'll probably get more information on this in this first panel, it seems that that Jewish emigration from Palestine is just as old as immigration. There were years during the first modern waves of immigration in the late 19th and early 20th century in pre-state Israel and Palestine, where there were more immigrants leaving the land of Israel shortly after their arrival than remaining there. And this tendency continued during the late 20s, when the mostly middle-class immigrants from Poland arrived during the so-called Fourth Aliyah. Even after the state was founded, there were recent olim, I don't think I have to translate these terms here, who in the language of the day became Yordim. So today there is still a Jewish diaspora, of course, next to the state of Israel, but in addition to the Jewish diaspora, we also have an Israeli diaspora. The most significant destination, of course, of this emigration from Israel was always the United States, and we will probably hear estimates later. I think the current number is about 600,000, but we also have to see what's the basis for these definitions of Israelis abroad. Another center, obviously, has been Western Europe, with popular destinations like London and Paris, and in recent years, Berlin, kind of a hip place for many young Israelis, and we'll hear a little bit more about this later today as well. In the early decades of the state, of course, the term emigration as such didn't really exist, just as the term immigration was not really part of the Hebrew vocabulary. I think Alroey kind of created it for Israel as well. Immigration instead of aliyah, and of course emigration instead of Yehudai. So we'll talk also about what we started last night, how much value-laden and maybe how much also connotated with certain stigma these terms are. The huge wave of immigration from the former Soviet Union brought the discussion about the emigration problem to a temporary halt in the 1990s and early 2000s. Within a few years, as you know, almost 1 million Jews entered the country and changed its face. But after the outbreak of the Second Intifada, when the number of emigrants again rose above that of immigrants, the discussion was revived. And there's also a lot of talk about a possible brain drain. We'll hear about this as well today. There are many reasons that push Israelis out of their country, but there's also a specific reason that might pull them into another country, and we have heard about this last night as well. The fact that the existing network of the Jewish communities help them integrate is certainly an additional factor that most other immigrants from other countries do not have. Israelis are often welcomed by the Jewish communities. In many places, they improve the level of the cultural Jewish life. And in some cases, especially in Europe, they receive financial assistance for helping with their expertise, and that might just be helping with Hebrew, in religious life and other areas. And of course, there's the past as well. Often the new arrivals feel a cultural attachment to their new country, especially being aware that their ancestors had lived there. And when we speak about Europe, it is also a matter of the passports. Most Israelis who arrive, let's say, in Berlin today, do not enter with their Israeli passports, but with EU passports, be it German or Hungarian or Romanian or Polish, that they got mostly through their grandparents. So over the next 4 sessions, we will hear from historians, demographers, political scientists, business scholars, writers, and others about the different effects of emigration from Israel and about the Israeli diaspora. We will hear about Israelis in the Silicon Valley and in India. We will explore the brain drain of Israeli academics, and we will hear from Israeli writers who live outside Israel today. But we begin, of course, I should say, of course, as a historian myself, with history. And it's my pleasure now to welcome the speakers of the first panel up to the podium. So please welcome our first panel, and we'll start in a minute. Okay, I think you all have, does that work? You all have the program in front of you, so I don't have to make a long introduction. You can read the short bios we put together. Our first speaker is Alroey, who is the head of the Ruderman Program for American Jewish Studies and Dean of the Faculty of Humanities at the University of Haifa. He is also very much involved in the Ruderman program between Haifa and now American University. And he will tell us about the beginnings of emigration, the Jewish immigration from Palestine between 1881 and 1939. Go, the floor is yours. Whatever you wish, just stick to not more than 20 minutes. That's the only thing you can speak.
30?
No. I'll be, because we want to have discussion.
Okay, but I have presentation. Okay, good morning, and thank you very much for the invitation, Michael, Laura, and Pam. I'm going to talk today about the Yerida, about the immigration from Palestine, actually about the participant in the session yesterday, but from historical perspective. So from the beginning of the first Aliyah, 1882, until the outbreak of World War II, more than 350,000 Jews immigrated to Palestine. About 50,000 immigrated during the Ottoman Empire until 1914, and more than 300,000 migrated during the British Mandate. Zionist historiography focused mainly on immigrants who came to Palestine and their contribution to the development of the Jewish Yishuv in Palestine toward the State of Israel. Very little was written about Jews who came to Palestine and left it during the Ottoman and British Mandate periods. Leaving the country is considered a deviation from the Zionist line and its antithesis. It was a slap in the face of the national struggle. Moreover, the emigration was perceived as an act of personal weakness rather than an expression of social phenomena worthy of studies. Apparently, there was no reason to focus on a person whose spirit was broken and decided to leave Palestine. Therefore, it's perceived as a subject that is not worthy of research attentions. Those who left, just like the immigrants Olim, are inseparable part of the history of immigration to Palestine, and the motives behind their departure give us a unique and interesting perspective on Jewish settlement in Palestine. My lecture will discuss 4 aspects relating the immigration for Palestine. How many left? Who left? Why did they leave? And the attitude of those who left. So, how many left? I will start in the late Ottoman period. Until 1909, the rate of those leaving was estimated at 75 to 80% of those who enter Palestine. It's very high rate if we compare it to the emigration from the United States back to Russia, which estimates about 5%. Beginning in 1909, following the construction of the city of Tel Aviv, the number of those leaving Palestine decreased. In 1912, the percentage of those leaving was estimated 58%, and in 1930 to 1914, the percentage of those leaving was estimated 44%. During the mandate period, there were 3 waves of immigration from Palestine. First wave of immigration was in 1923 to 1924. Second wave, 1927 to 1928, and third wave, 1936 to 1939. The demographer Everett Lee wrote once that to every stream there is a counter stream. So the counter stream that we can see in the 3 waves is, of course, reaction to the immigration, the 3rd Aliyah, 4th Aliyah, and the 5th Aliyah in the 30s. The attempt to estimate the number of immigrants is complex and involves a number methodological problems. At the beginning of the mandate period, the registration of people leaving the country was not organized and ordered, and was based on 4 parameters: a personal declaration of the passenger's intentions, the destination of the trip, travel time, and a return visa. Each of the 4 parameters was problematic and very unreliable. Yes, those are the 4 parameters. The passenger's personal declaration was subject to the traveler's wishes, and he did not have to fill it. Even if he filled out the statement, it is doubtful that he would have revealed his true intention. The destination of trip was based on the assumption that passengers sailing to distant destinations like the United States, South America, Australia, South Africa, attest to his intention to emigrate permanently. The assumption was that the person had no reason to travel long distances unless he wanted to settle in them. One should be suspicious of the question which related to the length of times the travelers intended to stay abroad. Not every traveler would openly admit that he was leaving the country permanently, and even more so if he was asked to answer this question before a British or Zionist official. Even the return visa could not have attested to a round trip. We have many sources that testify to the passenger who intended to leave the country permanently, but still acquire returning visa. Since the 1920s, the system of registration of immigrants has changed and was based on calculation of the total number of people entering Palestine, less the total number of departures, while ignoring passenger declarations. The resulting balance sheet indicated the number of de facto migrants per year. The new method eliminated the passenger's intent component as well as the distance and the returning visa components that became irrelevant. The new method was based on the net difference between those leaving and those entering. But at the same time, the old registration of the passenger continues that we can actually compare the two counting methods. The following table refers to the two methods of registration, and we can see the difference between them. Accounting the immigrants according to 4 parameters, we can see that between 1920 to 1929, about 10% of the immigrants who came to Palestine returned mainly to Eastern Europe, only few of them to America and other countries. And according to the new counting system, count of immigrants according to the net difference between departure and arrival, we can see that double. 20% left the country, one-fifth of the immigrants, which is quite a gap between the old and the new counting. Now, who left? The profiles of those leaving Palestine shows a trend of change in the population leaving the country. I focus now on the late Ottoman period. In the beginning of the 20th century, most immigrants were immigrants' family that the country was too small to absorb. The inability to find a livelihood or alternatively low wages that prevented them from maintaining their family. In later years, 1912 to 1914, after or during the construction of Tel Aviv, those who left were the idealistic pioneers. During this period, the economic situation in Palestine was relatively good, and immigrants with family who found work remained in Palestine. In 1912, for example, young people, pioneers, constitute 40% of those who entered the country, while among those living, the rate was about 60%. The profile of those living Palestine in the mandatory period. During the British Mandate period, 4 types of immigrants were identified: pioneers, entrepreneurs, middle class, and the locals. Pioneers of all sectors of the population who left the country during the Mandate period, the immigration of the pioneers was perceived as the most severe expressions of the ideological rift in the issue. From the other sectors, one could expect a certain percentage of dropouts, but this was not expected from the pioneers. The prevailing assumption was that the ideology is immune to immigration and that the pioneers are equipped with mental strength and are immune to the hardships of the country. What has occurred in the mind and soul of the pioneers can be defined as cognitive dissonance, a traumatic situations experienced by people when reality slaps upon their face. Entrepreneurs. This group is absolute opposite of the pioneers. The reason of their departure was economic and mainly immigrants who went bankrupt. More than once it was apparent that immigrants wanted to transfer their businesses from Europe to Palestine without even considering whether the business suited the country. In many cases, it turns out that because of this recklessness, the immigrants lost all his money and returned to Europe frustrated. Some of the wealthy immigrants left most of their property abroad, and after discovering that the country was not economically suited, to their businesses, they left it. Middle class, most of the middle class were craftsmen or shopkeepers. The pioneers explained the departure of the middle class by the absence of ideological motivation and concern of their economic interest. The middle class leadership claimed that the economic crisis they are experiencing are the direct result of a mistaken economic policy that harmed them. And locals, groups that wanted to go abroad to take a break for the hard life in Palestine, but did not rush back to it. There were mainly second generation of colonists from the first Aliyah and the old Yishuv, and of course the ultra-Orthodox community. Their problems evolved around the lack of land reserves and the difficulty of making a living from farming. The colonist children saw for themselves what was left from their parents after years of hard work. The figures that symbolized the magnitude of the crisis in the colonial sector was the Moshe Glikin, chairman of the Colonist Union in the Galil, who immigrated to Palestine in 1892 and left for Switzerland in 1922. And the old Yishuv, in the eyes of the ultra-Orthodox circles, with the beginning of the pioneering Aliyah, the country was filled with Epicurists who discredited the Shabbat. Some rabbis argue that since there were no remaining condition in the country for observance of mitzvot, the commandment to settle the land expired, and there is justification to leave it. Now, why did they leave? First, of course, the economic reasons. The main reason why people left Palestine was the poor state of the economy, which was not capable for absorbing the thousands of immigrants who were streaming in. The contrast quest for work, hunger, low wages led many people to the conclusion that sources of livelihood were sparse in Palestine and they would have to seek them elsewhere. Second, the cost of sailing. The low cost of sailing to Palestine allowed many immigrants, even if they lacked the money, to easily collect the amount needed to purchase the tickets. It was very easy to come. It was very easy to leave Palestine. Intentional immigration. Immigrants who arrived in Palestine with the intention of continuing from its onwards and saw it only as a corridor for leading to countries overseas. First and foremost, the United States. During the Ottoman period, there were the Japonchiks from the word Japan, young Jews who did not want to fight the Russia-Japanese war and came to Palestine. They became workers, saved money, and continued to America. During the British Mandate, there were the refugees of the civil war in Ukraine. They came to Romania and Poland, but they were threatened with deportation, and the Zionist institution gave them the opportunity. They arrived in Palestine and soon left. The fourth reason is chilly receptions from residents of Palestine and from the Zionist institution. For the very first encounter in Palestine, the newcomers met with chilly reception from residents of Palestine, especially hoteliers, people from the Moshavot, the colonists, and other recent immigrants who were already on their way, who cast doubt on their chances of making it in Palestine and recommend that they take the next ship right back to where they came from. The encounter confused and disturbed the newcomers. In addition to those I have mentioned, there were two more factors that promoted people to leave Palestine. In my opinion, these two factors explain why so many pioneers left. Not only did they, like the rest of the immigrants, have to deal with the objective difficulties of finding work, low wages, and an unwelcoming attitude, their youth and the desire for excitement and stimulations, which were not available in Palestine, led many of them to decide that Jewish people indeed belong in Palestine, but not at any price. The stimulation to which the young immigrants had been accustomed in the big cities in Europe was not be found in Palestine. For some of the pioneers, Palestine was just a depressing place. They came to Palestine with a solid national aspiration, sincerely committed to building the country and transforming themselves, remaking the social order and turning the Jewish people into a nation of land workers. And yet they were among the first to leave the country. Just as ideology was the main factor that had brought them to Palestine, it was also the main factor that drove them out. The more the expectation, the more the disappointment. And the attitude to those who left. During the first and second Aliyah, there was no moral judgment of those leaving Palestine. No one judged them ethically and saw them as traitors who abandoned the Yishuv in times of trouble. The term Yerida, for example, which has an ethical and moral significance and defames those who live, has not yet taken root in the terminology of the period, and the words used at that time were living or going out. Reports of those living were usually factual without interpretation or blame. This was mainly the migration of peddlers and small merchants who wanted to improve their lives in Palestine. When they came and found out that they had made a mistake, they left the country. It was a natural and clear act that carried no shame or disgrace. On contrary, during the British Mandate, the attitude toward the immigrants changed. From the beginning of the 1920s, the prevailing terminology in the Yishuv underwent a transformation and became judicial. The explanation for the change is that the geopolitical situation after the Balfour Declaration changed, and the level of politicization in the Yishuv led to the sharpening of the ideological messages, included the attitude toward the immigrants. Gradually, charged words entered the public discussion against the immigrants: Yordim, deserters, traitors. The introduction of the term Yerida into the Yishuv lexicon in the 1920s with its negative connotation is a clear example of the mobilization of language for the purpose of a national movement. From the 1920s to the present day, the Israeli who leaves the country is perceived as a Yored with a lower value scale than those who remain in Israel. Thank you.
Thank you, Gu, and you stayed perfectly on time. Thank you. So we'll have more time for discussion. And we'll leave the discussion to the end. Our next speaker is Yehudai, who, in a way, I would say, inspired me a little bit for this conference, because many years ago, when he started writing on his dissertation on the very subject he will talk about, we had many discussions about the topic of emigration in the early decades of the State of Israel. And I think this was really one of the very first, research, okay, better. One of the first research undertaken on this whole subject of Yerida or immigration, whatever you want to call it. And I hope we'll see the results soon published in a book. But for now, the topic is emigration from Israel in the early decades of the state. Do you have slides, or so we can turn these off then?
Okay. So thank you, Michael, for this introduction, and thank you to all the organizers for putting together this wonderful conference. As Michael already mentioned, this paper is part of a larger book project on Jewish emigration from Palestine and Israel after 1945. So I begin the story roughly where Gur ended his own presentation. And in my presentation today, I would like to focus especially on one aspect of this phenomenon, namely the impact of immigration from Israel on the wider Jewish world. And I will do so through one specific example or case study, the encounter between the Jewish community of Brazil and Jewish migrants who had left Israel during the early 1950s, but reached Brazil only after spending several months or years as trans-migrants in Europe. And in my conclusion, I will relate to the broader insights that this specific case reveals. So I'm talking about a small group of approximately 1,500 migrants. All of them arrived to Brazil as part of an ad hoc emergency resettlement operation organized by Jewish relief agencies. The operation took place in a period of less than 1 year between the summer of 1953 and the summer of 1954. But even though it was a small group of migrants, their arrival in Brazil resulted in a crisis, even scandal that shook the Brazilian Jewish community. Now, before getting into the details of this story, I should say that one of the things that surprised me when I started this broader research, and this is directly related to the events in Brazil, was that an important part of the story of Jewish immigration from Israel in the 1950s was the phenomenon of transit migration or trans-migration. Unlike the more familiar pattern of direct movement from the sending country to the country of destination, the term transmigration describes cases where migrants spend significant time periods in transit stations on their way to their final destinations. In such cases, the journey itself plays a crucial role in the migration process and shapes the experiences of migrants no less than the departure from the sending country or arrival to the arrival and settlement in the final destination. Transit migration is a familiar phenomenon in the history of modern Jewish migration. During the mass Jewish exodus from Eastern Europe in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, many Jews passed through various way stations in Central and Western Europe. Since many of those Eastern European migrants were in need of material support, their encounter with local Jewish communities in countries like Germany and England propelled tensions and conflicts alongside manifestations of Jewish and human solidarity. The same was true also of Jewish immigration from Israel in the early years of the state. Between the end of the Second World War and the mid-1960s, approximately 190,000 Jews left Palestine and Israel. But among the general emigrating population, there was one group of a few thousand immigrants that attracted considerable amount of attention during the early 1950s, the early to mid-1950s. These were people who had immigrated to Palestine or Israel after the Second World War, many from displaced persons or DP camps, or from Eastern European countries, in other words, mainly Holocaust survivors. But after spending various time periods in Israel, ranging from a few months to several years, decided to remigrate, decided to leave the country. Most of them wanted to go to the United States or to Canada, but due to technical reasons, they could not get there directly from Israel, and they had to use Europe as a stepping stone to their desired destinations. Many of them, however, could not realize their immigration plans even after arriving in Europe, and they ran into serious economic and legal troubles in their countries of transit. The stranded migrants, or trans-migrants, refused to return to Israel and became dependent on assistance from local Jewish communities and Jewish and non-Jewish support groups in Europe. They often got into conflicts with Jewish relief agencies operating in Europe, such as the American Jewish Joint Distribution Committee, or the Joint. The migrants expected to receive support from the agencies, but the agencies were often reluctant or even unwilling to provide support because they saw Israel as a country of Jewish immigration and not emigration. The Joint, in particular, the Joint was the most significant Jewish welfare organization operating in Europe after the war. And the Joint, in particular, had invested a lot of money and efforts in helping to send Jewish refugees from Europe to Israel. So the Joint decided that those returning from Israel to Europe were ineligible for support, which would be reserved for Jewish survivors of Nazism who were still waiting to leave Europe. Refugees who were still living in the camps in Europe and were still waiting for resettlement opportunities. Many stranded migrants from Israel concluded that the only solution to the difficulties in getting help was return to refugee life, which they tried to achieve by settling in DP camps in Germany and Austria. DP camps that still existed in Germany, especially in Germany, but also in Austria, even in the 1950s. The main concentration of those stranded migrants was the Fehrenwald DP camp near Munich. While most of the post-war DP camps were closed by 1951, Fehrenwald continued to exist until 1957, 12 years after the end of the Second World War, as the last haven for the sick and disabled DPs who most countries did not want to accept. Fehrenwald was also the unwilling haven of stranded migrants from Israel who gravitated towards the camp in the hope of relying on welfare and immigration assistance provided to the camp residents by Jewish organizations and by German authorities. Between 1948 and 1953, about 3,500 Jewish re-migrants from Israel entered Fehrenwald. But this influx ran counter to the efforts to close the camp and terminate the Jewish refugee problem in Germany and in Europe more generally. The German authorities declared in late 1952 that Fehrenwald would not accept any new arrivals. Nevertheless, re-migrants from Israel kept entering the camp. The movement subsided only towards the end of 1953 when the Germans established a police station in the camp to prevent further infiltration. Again, these are Holocaust survivors returning from Israel to refugee camp in Germany. But those who had already settled in the camp became a headache for the German authorities. Re-migrants who entered the camp after 1952 were considered illegal residents in the camp itself, but many migrants did not have any legal status in Germany more generally. During those years, the 1950s, all Israeli passports were stamped with the words valid for all countries except Germany. This was part of the generally very negative attitude towards Germany in the years following the Second World War in Israel, attitude in Israel. So it was very difficult for Israeli passport holders to obtain travel documents to Germany, and those who wanted to enter the country often smuggled themselves across European borders. An entire enterprise of cross-border smuggling and document forgery developed in order to facilitate the movement of Israelis into Germany. And ironically, some of those people who were involved in this movement, had reached Palestine as part of the illegal Zionist enterprise during the British Mandate period. So there were illegal migrants going into Palestine and then illegal migrants going back to Europe. The Germans decided to take strong police action against this illegality and started to imprison re-migrants and who had infiltrated into Fehrenwald and to threaten them with deportation back to Israel. But the German authorities were also willing to try and reach a peaceful solution through cooperation with Jewish international bodies. After intense negotiations between the German Foreign Ministry and the Joint and other Jewish organizations, the parties decided to announce a grace period of 6 months, starting August 1953, and during that period the Germans would suspend all police action against the re-migrants, and the Jewish bodies would make every effort to find new permanent homes to those re-migrants outside of Germany. And this is how the Brazilian resettlement program came about. The Joint and another major Jewish agency, the Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society, or HIAS, which is of course now in the headlines under the tragic circumstances of the Pittsburgh shooting. So those two organizations, the HIAS and the Joint, were able to obtain about 1,500 Brazilian immigration visas for Israeli re-migrants stranded in Germany. With the help of local Jewish organizations, the Joint and HIAS started to transport groups of re-migrants from the Munich area to the port of Hamburg, where the migrants boarded ships to Brazil. The majority went to Sao Paulo, and a smaller number arrived to Rio de Janeiro. Since neither the Joint nor HIAS was operating full relief programs in Brazil, they created a special emergency committee in cooperation with local community members in Brazil to handle the resettlement process. The organizations plan to support newcomers during their first 2 or 3 months in the country, and after that period, the migrants were to rely on assistance from local Jewish institutions. The scheme soon collapsed. It turned out the Jewish communal bodies in Brazil lacked sufficient resources to absorb the newcomers. Thus, in January 1954, the Joint reported that the influx of Israeli migrants to Germany, from Germany to Brazil, had created a critical situation which severely strained the entire Jewish communal setup for receiving new arrivals. According to that report, the main causes for the difficulty in integrating the migrants were serious shortages of housing and employment in Brazil, which were actually the same reasons that had pushed many of those migrants to leave Israel in the first place, and also greatly inflated cost of living in Brazil, according to the report. The situation was especially difficult in Sao Paulo. In the absence of trained relief staff in the community, private people were handling the reception work, often working the whole night through. In order to accommodate the inflow, the community withheld funds from local institutions. One result was that teachers in Jewish schools did not receive salaries, at least for some time period. The situation in the Jewish community of Sao Paulo was described as desperate and rapidly growing out of hand. According to another report, the community was up in arms, demanding that the Joint and HIAS immediately stop sending migrants from Europe. The material difficulties were compounded by ideological pressures. Already in December 1953, the United Zionist Organization of Brazil declared its negative stand against what it called the organized immigration from Israel to Brazil. The Zionist organization ordered all its representatives and institutions in Brazil to adopt the same negative attitude. It also called on HIAS, which had sponsored the largest number of Israeli migrants to Brazil, not to involve any organizations of the Jewish communities in assistance to the newcomers. The Zionist-oriented newspaper, the Brasilianer Jüdische Zeitung, supported this stance in a leading article in December 1953. The paper argued that immigration from Israel was detrimental both to Israel's interests and to the economic position of Jewish institutions in Brazil. The newspaper insisted that the migrants should not receive public welfare support, as they had come to Brazil not in flight of persecution, but were rather motivated by, quote, an urge to roam and follow the imaginary ring of gold and silver in their ears. Another report explained that immigration from Israel was a calamity to Zionists in Brazil, particularly because migrants had painted a terrible picture of life in Israel. The presence of migrants in Brazil undermined pro-Israel campaigns and aroused mistrust towards the very essence of the Zionist ideal. The same report explained that members and leaders of the Brazilian Jewish community were asking themselves, why should we help the migrants, the destroyers of our faith in Israel? And numerous other reports indicated the harmful influence of the Zionist campaign on the efforts to integrate the migrants in Brazil. The Joint and HIAS urged the Israeli government to step in and convince the Zionists in Brazil to lift the ban. The organizations explained that resettlement in Brazil was necessary in order to maintain the agreement with the Germans. If the operation collapsed, the organizations explained to the Israelis, the Germans would immediately start placing migrants on ships and deport them back to Israel. But the efforts to persuade the Israelis to intervene came to nothing. Israeli officials believed that this was a local problem which did not justify intervention. Moshe Sharet, the Israeli prime minister at the time, wrote in a cable to the Jewish organizations that the Israeli government could not request Zionist bodies in the diaspora to divert funds and energy for the resettlement of Israeli citizens who had left their homeland since this would defeat the Zionist fundamental purpose. Sharet added that deportation to Israel, he meant deportation from Germany to Israel, was, quote, likely to prove the most salutary method in stopping or at least discouraging the accursed Jewish wanderlust. David Shatiel, Israel's minister to Brazil, was quoted as saying, "Send the newcomers to the virgin woods in the Amazon region and let the feet survive. Israeli returnees or remigrants are traitors to their country and to the Jewish cause, and if the Joint and Hayats want to spend their money to help them, it is their business." Shaltier's response may sound harsh, but in fact, it reflected the deeply negative attitude towards immigration from Israel during that period. Another acute problem in Brazil, which was unrelated to the Zionist position, was the behavior of some remigrants whose requests for welfare grants, welfare support, had been refused. Some were so outraged that they physically attacked relief officers. Correspondence between representatives of the Joint and Hayas in Brazil and their offices in New York repeatedly mentioned the words beatings, attacks, riots, demonstrations, and terror. In one case, Amy Zal, who was the head of the Joint's office in Sao Paulo, was attacked by one of the migrants when she was trying to enter the office from the street. The migrant beat her with a stick, crushed her into the doorway, and smashed the glass of the street door window. Zal was not hurt, and several weeks later the attacker apologized. But the incident demonstrates the explosive atmosphere created by the movement of Israeli migrants from Europe to Brazil, and more generally it demonstrates the tensions between Jewish survivors of the Second World War and the bodies responsible for their rehabilitation. Despite those grave complications, the Joint and Hayas did not stop the influx to Brazil. As one senior official of the Joint explained, Brazil was a matter of life and death for us as an outlet for accumulations of migrants returning from Israel to Europe who had no other place to go but Brazil, and we simply had to keep that door open. To overcome the crisis, the Joint ultimately initiated a full-fledged relief program in Brazil. It sent experienced relief officers from Europe to take charge of the operations in Brazil. It upgraded its services in the country and improved its ties with local communities and organizations. Towards the end of 1954, reports from Brazil started gradually to assume a more positive tone, and it seemed that the relief program had achieved its goal of advancing the integration of Israeli migrants in Brazil. About 20 people returned to Israel with the help of the Joint and Israeli authorities, but the vast majority remained in Brazil, at least in the initial period following the end of the crisis. What should we make of this episode? I would like to offer three broad conclusions. First, we see that Jewish immigration from Israel in the early years of the state was a source of conflicts and tensions not only in Israel but also in the diaspora. The incident in Brazil was extreme but not exceptional. As I show in my larger book project, the arrival of Jews from Israel generated debates in the Jewish communities of the United States, Canada, and several countries in Europe. On one side of the debate, there were those who believed that Jewish public funds should not be invested in helping Jews living in Israel and undermining the Zionist cause. On the opposing side, there were those who claimed that decisions about humanitarian assistance should be based on the status of applicants and not on where they had come from. And this was a conflict between two principles. On the one hand, the idea of Jewish international solidarity, embodied in the Hebrew phrase Kol Yisrael Aravim Zeh B'Zeh, or all Israel or all Jews responsible for each other. On the other hand, support of Zionism, which became a matter of wide and deep consensus in the post-war Jewish world. So immigration from Israel presented Jewish diaspora communities with the moral and ideological dilemma. The second conclusion is that migrants and refugees were not passive actors in a post-war order. Although the dominant view in the Jewish and even non-Jewish world was that displaced Jews should settle in Israel, these people insisted on starting new lives elsewhere. Despite the initial refusal of the Joint to help Jews emigrating from Israel, the agency was eventually compelled to launch a full relief program to integrate remigrants in Brazil. And this shows that the remigrants had enough determination and power to sway the post-war relief system. But, and this brings me to the third and final conclusion, exactly because the remigrants had gone against the grain, against the expectations of the community, they placed themselves in the position of social outcasts and a pariah group, not only in Israel, but in the post-war Jewish world. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Ari, also, again, for sticking to our time. Our third speaker in the panel is Professor Uzi Rebhun, who is, I would say, the leading demographer today in Israel. He heads the Division of Jewish Demography and Statistics at the Hebrew University, and he will lead us now to, of course, some numbers, I am sure, because that's what demographers do. And he will talk more generally about the size and characteristics of the Israeli diaspora.
Okay, thank you. In immigration from Israel lies a paradox. On the one side, the number of Israelis who leave the country is small. The proportion out of the total population at origin, namely in Israel, pretty much resembles that of other Western societies. But at the same time, perhaps there's no other demographic issue that generates such a vibrant scientific and public discourse as immigration. And this mismatch should be attached to two more general characteristics of the Israeli society. The first is the feeling of many Israelis that the country is still in the process of nation building, of crystallization of its identity, and therefore immigration from the country contradicts Zionist ideology, but at the same time those Israelis also acknowledge the right of every citizen to freely choose where is the best place for him or for her to reside. Secondly, the living of the country may undermine the equilibrium between Jews and non-Jews, which is so central for the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and for ensuring a solid Jewish majority. And thirdly, immigration from Israel is significant because of recent changes in the profile of the immigrants. Not anymore people from low social status, but rather a growing proportion of people with academic education and white-collar occupations in the high-tech and in research, and also changes in the map of settlement of the Israeli immigrants, and especially the addition of Germany as a preferred destination. I would perhaps also add that immigration of Jews from Israel can be significant both demographically and culturally for the Jewish communities in the host countries. And I wish to perhaps start by trying to contextualize this discussion on the size and characteristics of Israelis abroad in the wider framework of world Jewish demography and the Jewish international migration system. And in 1948, on the eve of the foundation of the State of Israel, there were approximately 11.5 million Jews in the world. This number increased in a somewhat accelerated rate in the next 2 decades to about 12.5 million in 1970. This is mainly explained by the baby boom which took place following World War II in Europe and in North America, but it should also be attached to a relatively large number of Jews of African and Asian background, which at that time still exercised high levels of fertility and large families. And a number of Jews in the world continue to grow, although now in a more moderate pace, to slightly more than 13 million in 2000 and to 14.5 million in 2018. And this demographic increase is the result of somewhat contradictory trends in Israel on the one side and in the diaspora on the other side. While the Jewish population in Israel is on the rise, both because of high levels of fertility and also because of large influx of Jews to the country, the number of Jews, the number of their counterparts abroad decline, and accordingly the share of Israel out of world Jewry increased gradually from 6% in 1948 to about 20% in 1970, and to as high as 45% as Israel celebrated its 17th anniversary. And a major explanation for this rapid increase in the Jewish population in Israel, and accordingly also its share in world Jewry, is immigration. And from 1948 through today, some 5 million Jews immigrated between continents and major countries, and undoubtedly out of a Jewish population, out of the world Jewish population, would range from a minimum of 11.5 million to a maximum of 14.5 million. This is an unprecedented amount. About two-thirds of the Jewish international migration was to Israel. Those are the bold arrows. Those are the bold arrows in this figure. About 1/4 of the Jewish international migration originated in Asia and North Africa and Eastern Europe to Western countries, and about 15% was from Israel to Western countries, first and foremost the United States, but also Europe. And the volume of the various immigration streams of Jews to Israel is very strongly attached to the level of development of the origin countries, which are here measured by the Human Development Index of the United Nations. The ranking of the countries goes from one of a very high HDA to 180 of a very low HDA. So we can see that the lower the level of development of a given country, the higher is the rate of immigration of Jews from that country to Israel. So, for example, countries in Western Europe, which are here marked by black triangle, those are countries who are ranked higher on the HDA scale. This is the left x-axis of the figure. So the rate of immigration of Jews from those countries to Israel are low. By contrast, for example, the republics of the former Soviet Union, those are the red triangles, they are characterized by a low level of development, and the rate of immigration from those countries to Israel is rather high. And in this graph, you can also see a blue diamond. It indicates the rate of immigration from Israel per 1,000 population, and Israel is ranked 19th on the Human Development Index. So the immigration from Israel pretty much behave according to expectation of the nexus between development and immigration. In other words, a rather weak tendency to leave the country. And indeed, beside the population that lives in Israel, there are several hundreds of thousands of Israelis who live in other countries. Here we adopt the formal definition of the Central Bureau of Statistics, according to which an immigrant who's someone who is absent from the country for a consecutive period of 12 months, and unless otherwise is specified, the data here refer to both Jews and non-Jews, although according to various sources, about 90 or even 95% of the Israeli immigrants are Jews. And in 1990, there were approximately 300,000 Israelis who lived permanently abroad. This number increased to about 500,000 by the end of that century and to about 600,000 today. The main increase took place during the last decade of the previous century, largely due to either return migration or repeat migration, namely to a third country of immigrants who recently arrived from the former Soviet Union. But since then, the pace of immigration pretty much leveled off, and this is reflected in the percentage change between one point of time and a later point of time. This is the third column in the table, and also in the proportion or the percentage that the Israeli immigrants constitute out of the total Israeli population. This is the last column in the table. And another way, a kind of a complementary way to look at the extent of immigration is through annual data. And perhaps what is most important is the net migration, I mean the differential between those who return to Israel and those who leave the country. And while those balances are always negative, namely there are more Israelis who leave the country, this is the blue line, than return to the country, this is the orange line. Nevertheless, the overall trend, despite some fluctuations, is one of diminution of the balance, or at least stability. And this is true both for absolute numbers, this is the gray line, and also for net migration rate per 1,000 population, the yellow line. And about one half of the Israelis abroad live in this country, namely in the United States, another 6% in Canada. Western Europe is the home for about one-fourth of the Israeli immigrants, with a silent concentration in France, in the UK, and most recently, as Michael already mentioned, in Germany. About 6% live in the former Soviet Union, most of whom are return migrants. And here I should perhaps indicate that the amount of remigration of Jews who moved to Israel from the former Soviet Union is much larger than that which is represented in this figure, because there are many others who choose not to return to the former Soviet Union, but rather to move to a third country, mainly to here to the United States. And the remaining Israelis abroad are pretty much evenly distributed between Latin America, Oceania, and Asia, and Africa. And if we would have considered or focused only on the native-born Israelis, so then the share of the United States and more generally of North America would have been increased significantly to about two-thirds to three-fourths of the total Israeli immigrants. Moving now to some of the characteristics of the Israelis abroad, a major component is education. Education can attest, and it's a good proxy of the extent and of the significance of brain drain. At the same time, education is also a good predictor of economic attainment, and therefore the overall structural assimilation of the immigrants in the host society. And our data for around 2015 suggests that approximately one-third of the Jews in Israel, namely in the origin country, had an academic education of a bachelor degree or higher. This is the blue part of the rectangle. But among Israelis abroad, the rate is almost twice as high. And with some variations, this high level of Israelis with academic education can be found in most destination countries, but only with one exception, and this is Latin America, where the educational attainment of the Israelis is much lower than that of their counterparts who stayed in Israel. Now, one may perhaps argue that the education of the Israeli immigrants was obtained already abroad, not in Israel, and therefore the immigration is not very selective. So for part of the Israelis abroad, namely those who are native-born, and for some areas or parts in the world, we were able to cross-classify level of education with the duration in the country. And we can see that also among those who are in the new country for 5 years or less, and therefore it is likely that they acquired their education already in Israel, they also have levels of education which are significantly higher than those of Jews in Israel. And given this educational profile, I think, well, this is the graph, I'm sorry. And I think that given this educational profile, it is perhaps not surprising that Israelis abroad are disproportionately concentrated in white-collar occupations. About 1/5 of the Israelis in Europe work in professional, scientific, technical jobs, as again less than 10% of Israelis in Israel. Also about 10% of the Israelis abroad work in art, entertainment, and recreation, while only 2% of the Israelis in Israel make their livings in these areas. And in the other part, the other side of the occupational ladder, only 2% of the Israelis in Europe work in manufacturing and construction, as against almost 1/5 of the Israelis in Israel. As far as the Jewish identification is concerned, that of the Israeli immigrants is lower than that of the Jewish population in Israel. This is especially salient in regard to ongoing behaviors and those which have a religious meaning, such as keeping the Jewish dietary laws and synagogue attendance and lighting the Friday candles. The differentials are much smaller in regard to more intermittent behaviors of the major Jewish holidays of Yom Kippur and Passover. And I think that one of the reasons for these differences between Jews in Israel and Jews abroad is that among the latter, there was a very small proportion of religious Jews, certainly a very small, a tiny proportion of ultra-Orthodox Haredi Jews. And the data also point to some significant variation according to specific countries of settlement. High levels of Jewish identification characterize Israel's in the United States and in Latin America. By contrast, Jewish identification of Israelis in the former Soviet Union, most of whom, as I suggested earlier, are return migrants. The levels is small. What is perhaps also striking is the very weak Jewish identification of Israelis in Germany. And here I would like to suggest or to argue that this is at least partially associated with their demographic characteristics, which are not shown here, but most of the Israelis who move to Germany are young, they are singles, they come from a very secular background, and they have a very strong inclination, or they lean very strongly to the political left. However, Jewish identification strengthened with the prolongation of time in the new country, and for at least one country, namely the United States, we calculated the ratio of ritual observance and communal affiliation between Israelis who are in the country for more than 10 years and the more recent immigrants. So a score of 1 attests to similarity between those two groups. A score which is higher than 1 suggests that the more veteran immigrants have a more stronger Jewish identification than the more recent immigrants, and a score which is lower than 1 suggests that Jewish identification is stronger among the more recent immigrants. And as you can see in all 6 indicators, the ratio is above the threshold. And this is especially significant for institutional affiliation of synagogue attendance and membership in JCC, which might perhaps reflect not only a quest for Jewishness, but to some extent also necessity for social integration. At the same time, the ties to Israel weaken. And I focus here on 3 types of connection to Israel, namely emotional attachment to Israel, familiarity with the social and political situation in Israel and consider self-Israeli. And for all three indicators, the ratio between the veteran immigrants and the more recent immigrants is either one or lower the one, namely that longer duration is associated with lower levels of Israeli identification. And I will add here that very similar findings, namely that tenure is positively related or connected with the lower levels of Jewish stronger levels of Jewish identification and weaker connection to Israel, was found not only in the United States but also in other countries, especially in Germany. And these observations coincide with John Berry's theory on assimilation into religious and ethnic identity of the local community, of local group belonging, and gradual decline of ties to the homeland. This is cell C in this two-dimensional scheme, and it refutes other three competitive trajectories represented in cells A, B, and D, namely of marginalization, that is the weakening of both religio-ethnic identification and ties to the homeland, of integration, of the strengthening of these two factors, and of the perspective of separation, according to which migrants will exhibit a preference for maintaining ties to the culture of origin and will avoid interaction with the members of the religio-ethnic community in their new country. So based on these empirical observations and also some of the findings from my research over the last several years, I wish to very briefly offer three major conclusions. One is that the number of Israeli Jewish immigrants, and especially given that about half of them are Jews who moved to Israel and then either returned to the home country or moved to a third country. So overall, the number of Israelis who leave the country, both in absolute numbers and relative to immigration from other Western societies, the numbers are low. And I think that these findings attest that, generally speaking, Israelis are strongly connected to the country. They want to stay in the country. They want to live in the country. They are satisfied. They are happy with their living in Israel. And this is true both for the native-born Israelis and for the foreign-born, namely those who moved, who immigrated to Israel. A second conclusion is that despite this small number of immigrants, nevertheless, there are a selective group of young Israelis with high levels of education. This group has a special potential to contribute both to the development and to the prosperity of the Israeli society. So the research and the high tech and the Israeli art, which are already today very advanced, could have taken off to new heights with those thousands and tens of thousands of Israelis who would have either stayed in Israel or at least returned to the country. And a third and final conclusion is that Israeli immigrants strengthen the Jewish communities in the diaspora. They increase the number of Jews in those communities. They increase the number of Jews who are affiliated and have a strong commitment to Jewish life. And even if their identification and connection to Israel somewhat declines over time, I believe it is still quite strong, and those Israelis can really help both the local Jewish community and the general community, the general population in those places, to better understand the complexity of the political and of the social and the cultural situation in Israel, namely advocacy, and also help, especially at times of attempts on the part of extreme groups to delegitimize and boycott the country, to boycott Israel. Thank you.
Thank you, Uzi, for this wonderful overview of numbers and tendencies and trends, and also for telling us that it's not such a dramatic movement as some people sometimes want to believe. We're very happy to have with us, and we're very happy to have had with us for many years at American University, Kelvin Goldscheier, who is one of the leading sociologists, demographers of the history and presence of the Jews, and his most recent book is in fact about Israeli society in the 21st century, and I think he is the most appropriate person to tie it all together, give a short response, and open it up later to our questions.
I'll try to do that. First, I want to say that all three papers make significant contributions to our understanding of Israelis living outside of the State of Israel in different ways. So I'm not going to really talk about the three papers separately. I'm not going to present criticisms of or an evaluation of their work. I think they've made significant contributions, and I think our goal here should be to find the connections among the various papers. How do they fit together? How do we understand it? There's a lot of stuff out there. There's a lot of information. There's a lot of data. I could probably spend a day or two talking about the limitations of all the data that were presented, and I think Uzi could also spend another day and a half talking about it, but that's not the goal. The goal is to say, here's a set of information which we have. It's the latest information. What can we make of it? How can we put it all together? So I'm going to try to do that in a few minutes and try to present some guidelines or questions that we ought to ask ourselves as we listen to these papers and presentations. The first point is that migration of any kind, emigration, immigration, represent linkages, connections between places, between people, between countries. And it's important to keep that in mind. And because it connects places of origin and places of destination, and I neutralize it, not talking about Israel, not talking about the United States, and not talking about Brazil, but because it represents connections, it has an impact, not only on the place of destination, but also on the place of origin. So we have to think about migration as some set of processes that link and connect and have an impact on at least two societies and perhaps more. Because it also has an impact not only on places, but on people, on the migrants themselves. Now, migration we think of as moving from one place to another, but migration can be, in fact, as some reported, temporary. It doesn't have to be permanent, as long as we define what we mean by temporary. It can be circular. Not all those who came from country X to go to country Y have the counter stream from that same areas. There may be another counter stream. So there may be circular migrants. They may be stepwise migration, moving from one place to another and in between stopping one place. And we have return migration, people who go to one place and come back. Once we can at least identify the contours of that kind of movement, we have to find out who is moving. And we heard a little bit about who is moving, again, given the constraints of the evidence that we have. Are these individuals who are moving? Are they moving as families? Are they moving as groups? And here it's extraordinarily important because moving as a family is a very different process than moving as individuals. And then we have, of course, the fundamental question of the selectivity of the migrants. If the individual moves, the question might be first asked, the individual moves, he, she are by themselves, who do they marry? Who do they connect up with in a very intimate way in the place of destination? And once we begin to think about families, we really need to know about who they left behind. Where are their extended families? We have, I would venture to say, we have almost zero information about those kinds of connections. We have some anecdotal information, but we don't have a series of serious things. How many people left their families back there? How many people, and I'll reinforce this in a moment with another piece of information which we don't have. I could go on all day about the information we don't have. But it's very important to think in these terms because marriage and connections and networks become the key elements associated with migration. Now, as we begin to think of this movement between two places, that tends to be treated fairly statically. Now, both the state of Israel and the places of destination, say the United States, have changed over the last 30 years. So we can't treat them simply as movement from one place to another and they have this kind of selectivity until we know what are the changes in places of origin and destination. It's very clear that migrants from Israel leaving in the 21st century are leaving a very different kind of society than migrants who left in the 1950s or 60s or 70s or 80s. And they're coming to societies which are also radically different than they had been in the past. You may not believe this, but the United States has not remained static over the last 50, 60 years. I know it looks that way, but. And therefore, once we begin to think about the selectivity and who's doing the moving, we begin to face the critical question about migration and integration. It's not what happens to the migrants or what happens to their families, but what happens intergenerationally, what happens to the children of migrants. Because that's really the critical question. It's not surprising that people who grew up in Israel come to leave the state of Israel for whatever reason, come to a place of destination, say the United States for simplicity, that they remain Israelis of some kind or another. Critical question is what happens to their children? What happens to the next generation? How does that ethnic identity, and I use the word carefully, how does the ethnic identity of Israelis get transmitted from one generation to another? And that, again, despite a lot of research, we have very little research on that process of intergenerational change. Now, one of the papers, and I think in important ways, reminds us that in the 1950s, in the late 40s, institutions played a critical role in migration. So we heard about institutions in Brazil, institutions internationally, institutions in Israel. Institutions in the past and currently play a role, sometimes a positive role, in the exodus from the state of Israel, and sometimes a negative role. And I think we have to study not only the migrants, not only places of origin and destination, but what are the institutions and what is their role, if any, in the process of assisting, providing the auspices of what we call the auspices of migration. Now, in addition, while I'm throwing out questions, I'm going to throw out a few other concepts which I think are very important. In looking at what happens to the migrant in places of destination, We need to study not only the individual migrant, but the enclaves. You want residential segregation, that's sort of the heavy word, but the enclaves. And in fact is that one can, in various places in the United States and elsewhere in Europe, find enclaves of Israelis who interact with one another, who create their own new institutions, their own kinds of connections. And I think we need to study that as well. So the key question is, who do these migrants link up to? They don't enter a country and just live in a period of time that's independent. They connect up with others, and usually with other Israelis. Perhaps less so than with a formal Jewish community, but with other Israelis. And one thing to seriously consider is that migration is not simply one way. Today in the 21st century, I think it is the 21st century, in the 21st century, people fly back and forth. People visit. People have connections. In the past, bless you, people in the past, when they left Palestine, when they left Israel, left. It wasn't easy to leave, and it certainly wasn't easy to go back, not simply because of ideological reasons, and not simply because they didn't have any family back there, but simply because it was travel back and forth was not easy. Today, even Israelis come to the United States for short periods of time because it's relatively easy. And most Israelis, and it's very interesting, they send their children abroad, they have families back in Israel if they have left Israel. So the connections are no longer absolute. The cutting off of ties is not absolute, but there's a whole series of new networks that are formed. What did I say wrong? Did I say something? Is it okay? Yeah. There are new forms of networks that are assisted, facilitated by, enhanced by the whole technological revolution associated with flying and so on. I remember many years ago, before most of you were born, and when I was in the university, many of my colleagues thought about going to Israel for a year. Right? Many thought about it. About 3 out of 100 would go, and they would take a boat, and it would take weeks, and it would be a real effort to do that. And today, the same 3% go, but they get there quicker, and they come back. You can get by the way, you can get a round trip ticket, and that's an important one. Let me finish. In addition to these families visiting and families reconnecting and enhancing the nature of communities in both places of origin and destination. Very important. Uzi made the point that the presence of Israelis might enhance the Zionism and Jewishness of places of destination. But it's also the case that those kinds of trips enhance the communities in the state of Israel. There's a powerful interaction effect, sometimes positive and sometimes not so positive, but it enhances both, and that's a very serious part of the question of how identity is formed. So this integration process that we talk about, the power of integration of the migrants leaving Israel, is not simply what one individual does. It's not simply a focus on individuals. It's a whole process, and we need to study its complexity a little bit more than we have. And I hope that this conference and other conferences similar will enhance not only our understanding, but will enhance the kind of research that we need to do in order to study these processes. Thank you.
Thank you, Kelvin, for indeed tying it together and asking a lot of questions. I don't know if these can be answered here, but we can come back at least to some of these aspects. I have see the first hand down, and I think, do we have a microphone, or otherwise we can just, okay. Oh, for the audio. Here we go. Behind you.
First of all, thank you very much for the very interesting talks. I'm from a completely different field, and for me it was enlightening. One question for Gul, and then, or a comment maybe, and then a general comment. The data that you showed on one way to look at the immigration in the old days was to look at the net of how many came, how many left. The question is, since a certain fraction of these were merchants and bringing things to Israel and selling things abroad meant coming and going. So if you had, I don't remember the numbers, but if you had 300,000 coming and 60,000 leaving, which gives you a high percentage of leavers, but half of the leavers also returned, came and went, it cuts your leavers by half, but it only marginally reduces the number that come, and so the ratio of those who left to those who came will fall substantially. So it would, I don't know if it's even possible to gauge how many are like that, but it would change the statistics quite dramatically if there is something to what I think there may be. And general comment on a variant of this issue of leaving Israel. This is a university. It's a rather detached academic setting, which it should be. Yesterday was more on the emotional side of what it means to leave and so on. But one variant of this is from the old days in Israel. For the Israelis here, you'll know what I'm talking about. Balad lo-ozev kibbutz. For the person who leaves a kibbutz. My parents were Palmachnikim that went and were among the people who established Kibbutz Malkia in the northern border. And at a certain point left the kibbutz, as did nearly everyone who eventually, who were among the people who created that particular kibbutz. None of them were around, I think, 20, 30 years later, but the kibbutz evolved. And kibbutzim in Israel evolved. By the way, that song, which is a very emotional song, it was banned on the radio because it was like refuting a major ideology of Israel. But the kibbutzim eventually evolved, and they went through a rough patch, and they're different from the kibbutzim of once upon a time. And there is maybe a lesson for this in Israel, until we reach the other example I want to give, which is Jerusalem. The numbers here, and Michael, you mentioned that the rate of immigration isn't that high a number, and you're right, until you dig a little bit deeper. Israel is the least equal country, almost, except for the US in the developed world, has the highest poverty rates in the developed world, and so a huge chunk of the country is in no position to go anywhere. Of the people who we see leaving, they primarily come from a certain subset of Israel. And then the question is, what is the share of them? And here's where Jerusalem becomes maybe the relevant parable for Israel. Because Jerusalem, through all kinds of policies and politics and so on, is a country which became it has very high shares of ultra-Orthodox Haredim and very high shares of Arab citizens or residents who are very poor. Those are two very, very poor communities. And the burden that's on all the rest, not to mention the change in the vibe, led to a massive migration out of Jerusalem. When I say massive, it's not really massive. It's massive out of a certain population, which is all the ones that were left in Jerusalem, not necessarily out of the share of the entire total in Jerusalem. And the thing is, Jerusalem is totally incapable today of maintaining itself. It needs Israel to maintain itself. My concern is what happens when Israel becomes Jerusalem, and the outward and the westward flow continues just across the Mediterranean and the sea, rather than from Jerusalem to the coastal plains, and that's something that we see enveloping. The numbers are still small, but it's a concern, a major concern going forward.
You want to address it?
Yeah, I agree that it's very difficult to count how many people left Palestine in the late Ottoman period and during the British Mandate period. It's only evaluation. You know, the head of the Information Bureau in Jaffa, Menachem Shenkin, evaluate that it's between 75 to 80%. And in the mandatory Palestine, we know that only that in 1927, it was the only, and I think the first year that more people left the country than entered. But the most important thing, I think, it's know how many left, but the discourse in the Yeshuv in Palestine. And it was absolutely a social phenomena about the Yordim and the Jews who left Palestine. And I think, and what I've tried to present in my lectures is about the pioneers, those who came with the Zionist ideology and left the country because the ideology. So I think it's general evaluation about 20% in Palestine mandatory and about 80% and later half, 50% in the Ottoman period. But I agree, it's very complicated to know the exact numbers.
I don't know if you. I mean, there's another Yehudai, of course, another wave of migration from Jerusalem to Tel Aviv for secular Jews, which might be over by now, but and maybe vice versa of others. So there, of course, internal migrations.
It's not Yehudai, it's running away.
Well, from Jerusalem down. Yes.
Just a quick comment. I'm not an expert in the internal migration of people from Jerusalem to other parts of the country. But I think that, well, I agree with you that most of those who leave Jerusalem come from the more secular, traditional segment of the Jewish sector, and they are very highly educated and from the medium high social status. Nevertheless, about half of those who leave are ultra-Orthodox, who cannot allow themselves to buy the very costly apartment in Jerusalem. So this is one thing. And the other thing is that the Orthodox community is not a static community, not at all. It's very dynamic. And many of them are now going out and study, come and visit the Hebrew University. You'll see a lot of Orthodox Jews. The proportion of the unemployment rate among Orthodox women is very similar to the unemployment rate among the non-Orthodox women. And it might be that the ultra-Orthodox Jews in Jerusalem will replace the very highly educated secular Jews who left the city. So I think the processes are very dynamic and often are unexpected. And I'm optimistic both about Israel and also about Jerusalem.
You also have to define what you mean by quality.
Okay, we have quite a few more. So Mena, I think, is first.
Hi, thank you for your presentations. One quick question since we began mentioning the Haredim and Jerusalem and Tel Aviv and the migration there. I'm just wondering, we don't have anything here about the Haredim and Brooklyn and that diaspora. Would that be an interesting thing to look at to see how those linkages are? Just throwing it out there. Thank you.
And maybe we'll collect a few. I'm very happy my predecessor is director. Russell, please.
Thank you all for your presentations. I think some of us were puzzled by Uzi's both numbers and interpretation that there's a relatively low level of immigration. And as I was thinking about it, I realized that we might have part of the answer to this in a problematic nature of the way the Central Bureau of Statistics counts immigration. That is, people who have been out of the country for a year or more. And it could be a technical question, perhaps you know the answer. And that is, if somebody leaves, but within a year comes back on re-entry, ching, they're no longer an immigrant, even though they might be coming back for business reasons, for family reasons, for a short visit. And as we've seen, we're now in an era similar to what Gur mentioned existed before the 1920s, when travel was relatively easy and cheap. It's now, again, relatively easy and cheap, whereas in the interim, as Kelvin pointed out, it wasn't either easy or cheap for people to leave. So you can understand why the Bureau of Statistics will want to maintain a stable measure, but as times and conditions change, that measure may indeed be out of date. So the question, how long have they used this measure? Is it indeed the fact that if somebody re-enters within a year, they're no longer considered an immigrant, even though they might be coming back for short periods? And as we recognize, much of the higher education, high-tech migration is one where people go back and forth. So whether they've relocated, the same with academics, the same with many Haredim. Although a large part of the community is poor, if you leave on any given flight from New York to Israel, you realize that there are a large number of Haredim on the move as well. So could all of these result in an underestimation both of the amount of immigration and with your interpretation that it's relatively low?
One more, and then we have more other coming afterwards. I'm also glad Dalit Parser from the Israeli Embassy is with us. So Dalit, you need a mic for the audio. And the others will also, everyone has a chance to just have answers in between.
Thank you so much for your presentations. Definitely very interesting. I have actually two questions. Professor Rebhun, you just, in your data, we saw that it's many young people and professionals leaving the country. What impact does that have on the future? We didn't speak on the future, but do you see any trend where this would go to? That's my first question. And the other question, what you just mentioned, is about the Yerida, so-called, from Jerusalem to Tel Aviv. Is there a correlation also with academic people, very high educated, skilled professionals going abroad? Happy to learn more.
So we'll have one round of answers and then we'll take more questions.
So for the first question, I didn't have enough time to go in depth into the definitions and how CBS measures the immigrants. Let me just add to what I said during my lecture, that an immigrant is defined as such if he or she is out of the country for a consecutive period of 12 months. Now, they can come and visit the country, conditioned that they don't stay in the country for more than 90 days. So if they come for 2 weeks or even for 1 month, they are still considered immigrants. So I don't think that this would probably change dramatically the number or the estimate of immigrants. I would also add that I referred only to the first generation. It didn't take into account the second generation, and I assume that there are some tens of thousands of children of Israeli immigrants who were already born abroad. Whether to take them into account or not, it's a matter of a subjective decision. There are even scholars like Yinon Cohen that sometimes argues that the return migrants, namely those who made Aliyah, immigrated to Israel, and then returned to the home country or moved to a third country, they should not be regarded as immigrants. And if we don't count them, so the numbers even go further down from 600 probably to about 400. So, of course, definitions determine numbers. Regarding the second question, yes, although the numbers are not very high, but many of the immigrants are highly educated, and they work in high tech and in research and in academia. And I think that I refer to this in my second conclusion, that the Israeli society and the Israel academia and the Israeli high tech could have much benefit if those Israelis would have stayed in Israel, no doubt. So it's really a brain-drain, and I assume that Danny will elaborate on this in his presentation. And here I assume that we will reach a consensus. The numbers are not, I mean, I'm a demographer. I make my living from quantitative analysis, but I believe that quantitative is not the whole story. Qualitative is also very important.
The people that that had come to Israel, like displaced people coming in after the World War, and then left, I understand that from the point of view of the joint and from the point of view of the State of Israel, they did not want to be Israelis, but were they Israelis at all? I'm thinking both of the people that you described, and thinking of my life in the Silicon Valley, where there are a lot of Russians that, to former Soviet Union, spending some time in Israel in the early 90s and then departing from Israel 2 or 3 years later to the U.S. So Israel was really a place of transmigration. And then, and you just mentioned Yinon, so there's something about, is it fair to count their individual experience as that of Israelis living Israel?
Hi, thank you for putting the conference together, and thank you for the presentations. I did want to focus a little bit on children, I guess. One of the things, Dr. Rebhun, that you talked about was embracing Jewishness over time after people have emigrated. I wonder whether people having children that might be an impetus for that, having children and then putting them into Hebrew school, that kind of thing. And then another issue I was curious about was another way people might demonstrate an affinity towards Israel after they've left, not necessarily an affinity towards religion, but an affinity towards Israel, is if perhaps they enroll their children in these Hebrew public charter schools that have begun to proliferate here in the United States, and I believe elsewhere as well, at least in a few instances. Those are secular schools, usually public schools, where they teach Hebrew, and they'll have classrooms named after cities in Israel, and that may be a way to develop an affinity. And I'm wondering whether that might be happening. And then finally, just one other thing for Dr. Alroey. Could you again review what I didn't quite understand what you meant about issues with Zionist organizations somehow being uncomfortable with certain populations in Israel and basically making them uncomfortable and asking them to leave. So if you could review that again, please.
I'm a mother of 2 lone soldiers, and I just want to mention this very interesting, I think, in the perspective of research, very unique group that I would like to know better what is going on with them, why they do it, what is going to happen after the military service. We don't have enough data for that, as I know.
This is a historic question, I guess, for Gur Alroey. I recently read what I would call an anecdotal study of Palestine in the early 1930s by a European journalist who spent several months there. And one of the things he did was interview a lot of recent immigrants who were doing well and some who were doing terribly economically, couldn't find their feet. And the key seemed to be histadrut. And he talked about how immigrants who were not connected, affiliated, registered with histadrut just couldn't get employment. And I wondered if that was accurate. His was an anecdotal study. And if that was accurate, what the effect might have been on those who emigrated out of Palestine in the 1930s because they were not affiliated with what was the Jewish establishment creating a society.
I'm sorry, Scott, and then we'll have to close it.
Hi, thank you. I just have two brief questions. One is, do we know what the effect is of Yehudai, perhaps on Aliyah, meaning Israelis coming to the United States and Europe and different places, and how that affects Jews here deciding to then make Aliyah? And then also the consideration of shlichut in the immigration statistics. So we're thinking about Israelis who are coming here for a year or two, but then sometimes they stay a little longer. How does that affect the statistics? And do we consider those people coming here permanently, or they had the intention of going back, but sometimes they end up staying longer? So how does that affect the statistics?
Thank you. And also don't forget we have 3 more sessions where some of these aspects will be also discussed. Scott.
Wonderful presentations, everybody. Thank you. A question and a comment for Gur. I don't know if you're going to, or if you've already started to look at the pattern of emigrating and coming back. I'm thinking of the story of probably the most famous immigrant, or Yored, to America, Shimon Agranat, who I know from, some people may know Penina Lahav's book, how he came and the family left and then he came back. And there must be an obviously smaller subset, but anyway, that's just a suggestion. A question, in this period in the middle of the mandate, when you said the Zionist leadership really started to focus on this question, change the discourse, come up with new pressure tactics, psychological, maybe Yerida, was there at all a collaboration or dialogue with the Jewish communities? I'm thinking mostly about America. I don't know much about the European settings, but was there a dialogue with the Jewish establishment in the U.S. in the 20s to try to incentivize people not to leave or to stay? This is also the period, it's when it just begins to consolidate. American Jewish Committee joins the Zionist Collective, and right when you say the Zionist leadership is clamping down on Yerida, it's also when American Jews are kind of waking up to supporting Zionism. And just a quick question to Uzi, on this survey, why do you, at least in the slides, you focus on action in terms of Jewish identification, synagogue membership, and many things, activities, kashrut, whereas in the Pew and other surveys, it's often a mix of attitudes and behaviors, attitudes and actions. Are you also looking at attitudes and questions like that? Thank you.
My question is about happiness. So, as you know, economists have beginning about 20 years ago, to look at various measures of national happiness. And there's about 3 or 4 major indices out. And I was wondering if any of you, probably especially Uzi, but then Dan, good, I'm glad Dan is here too, maybe you can comment on that, have correlated between the emigration from Israel and the National Happiness Index. For those of you who haven't seen it, interestingly, Israel is ranked very high on happiness on all of these indices, which are compiled by very different organizations with very different, well, somewhat different methodologies. And so if Israelis are happy, then why do they leave? And so I think that that's a very interesting question.
Thank you. Okay. We start with Uzi. You had a lot of questions.
Yes, not sure that I have answers to all of them, but I think that the first three questions and also the questions on behaviors and attitudes, they have a common denominator because they refer to issues of definition and of quality of the data and the richness of the data. And not always we have the infrastructure that we can answer all questions. I we don't have in, as far as the service that I work with, we didn't have any question on this type of Jewish school, of those public schools where pupils can study Hebrew. So it's not something that I was able to explore. I didn't try to see to what extent getting married and having children enhances the Jewish identification of the Israeli immigrants, although we do know from the local Jewish community that those are critical stages in which Jewish families do participate more often, become members, official members of the community, and it stands to reason that this also is true for Israeli immigrants. I don't know about the connection or the effect of shlichim or missaris that come here and stay longer, and to what extent they increase the number of Israelis. By the way, it's true also for the children of diplomats who come here and their children study in high school, and the parents might need to go back to Israel while they are seniors in high school, so they will stay here for another year, might decide to skip the military service in Israel and stay here and go to school. But eventually, my assumption is that even if it does has any effect, it's very marginal. I don't know if I assume that you refer to this project, which is called Tzabar, of children of Israelis who go at the age of 18 and serve in the army. I think that there are a few studies on this topic, but I'm not familiar with them. Eventually, probably they reduce to some extent the number of Israelis in the country, or the number of Israelis abroad. But again, I don't think that the numbers are huge. That doesn't have any dramatic effect on the figures, on the numbers that I suggested for the size of the Israeli diaspora. And happiness, yes, as you said, Israel is ranked 11th on the list of countries. I think it is ranked highest that countries such as Germany and very close to Canada, and higher than the United States. So, and this relates also again to one of my conclusions that this is one of the explanations why many Israelis do not leave the country, but rather stay in the country. Now, someone told me, well, perhaps Israelis are ranked very high in the happiness index. Perhaps they are ranked very high in the stupidity index. But let's assume that they are clever, they recognize the benefits and the advantage of living in Israel. And I think there's a close correlation between happiness and the low rate of immigration from the country. Statistics don't lie.
Okay, well, we got a very short.
Statisticians do.
A very short comment, question, Israeli thank you all. Thank you all. This was, I think, we all feel very illuminating. For me, the biggest understanding that I gained through this panel is the level of exaggeration and I would like, being an author of fiction, I would like to call it fantasy, that is attached to the numbers, and how sobering and surprising the actual numbers were for me. Because various groups have an interest or an imagined interest or some need to exaggerate the numbers of Israelis living abroad. And it could be people who are very Zionist and have this alarmist tendency, or people who are post-Zionist, or I don't even know what the motivations are. But the contrast between the actual numbers that Uzi, you described here, of in the U.S., people like to throw the number 1 million because it's kind of it's a scary or exciting number. It's like a big thing. It's as if a very well-kept secret. And here you are talking about less than a third of this number, and that is also including a certain wave of immigration that came from the former Soviet Union, stayed in Israel for a bit, and just moved on. So that's a very big difference. And I think that it's something to look at why the need, and why do you think there's this fantasy that there's so many more? And why are we all so surprised to hear the reality?
And maybe we can leave, because I also thought even the numbers given last night were very different from the numbers now. But maybe we can also leave this for the afternoon panel, where we'll definitely come back to the numbers in the US and the other places. And just one more sentence, of course, in Hebrew literature too, it's almost a genre, it's a motif which is recurring. Jews in South America, Eshkol Nevo, or in Berlin, there is books on that, or Uganda, even the fiction, the fantasy. Anyway, we still have two more panelists to.
Can I just add one thing?
And of course, Kelvin.
That myths are very powerful.
Yeah.
That's number one. And we have a tradition in the United States in the recent period called fake news.
Mm-hmm. Demographers always knew what that was, right? They always dealt with that. Already.
So there was a question about Israelis, or the Israeli identity of immigrants. And indeed, in the 1950s, the majority of people who left the country were not native-born Israelis. They were new immigrants, or olim. Although there was a process of change, and towards the mid-1960s, the majority of immigrants were already native-born Israelis. But those who were not non-native-born spent sometimes very short periods in Israel, sometimes 5 years, sometimes just several months. Sometimes they came to Israel just as a stepping stone to other countries. But legally and formally, they were Israelis because they had Israeli passports, and this had an impact on their abilities and their prospects of settling in other countries. It also had a negative impact on their chances because those organizations, the organizations that mentioned before, we mentioned earlier, they did not want to help people who were they called it firmly resettled in Israel. People who were officially Israelis were not eligible for assistance, which was given to refugees, people who were not resettled. So in that sense, the legal status of being an Israeli was a disadvantage for immigrants. Now, the question of identity is a bit different because people who came, let's say, to the United States after spending 2 years or several months in Israel and had come to Israel from Europe were perhaps not very different from people who came to the United States directly from Europe. So I don't think that their Israeli identity was very important in shaping their longer-term experiences or identities. But people who spent longer periods in Israel, for example, German Jews or Polish Jews who came to Palestine in the 1930s, talk about, in their memoirs or oral histories, they mention the period that they spent in Israel as formative periods in their lives. So they continue to reflect on the importance of the years that they spent in Israel, even decades after leaving the country. There was also a question about the impact of immigration on the encounter between immigrants and Jewish diaspora communities. So in the 1950s, there was a concern in Israel that immigration would have a negative effect on the efforts to bring more Jews into Israel. Not only because of the sometimes very negative stories that people told about the reality in Israel in the 1950s, but also the very presence, the very immigration, the very fact that people left Israel during those years seemed to be dangerous because the presence of people living Israel or coming to other countries would mean that perhaps reality in Israel is not so attractive, and there was a concern among Israeli officials that immigration would have a negative effect on the efforts to bring more Jews into the country.
Okay, I will do it very short. I mentioned the chilly reception from the Zionist institution, and I didn't elaborate it, but what I meant is that the immigrants complained about the lack of sufficient attention from the Zionist institution that did not pay attention about the immigrant from the moment they arrival. They expected that the Zionist institution in Palestine will help them to settle in, but it didn't happen, and we can see it even today that when Jews come to Israel, they expect that the government will help them. It's completely different from what we know from the immigrant in the that came to the United States. Now, about the 30s, first the immigration in the 30s was very, very low because the situation in Europe. Really very few Jews left Palestine. Now, most of the immigrants who came to Palestine, both in the first and second Aliyah, and then in the third, fourth, and fifth Aliyot, most of them were immigrants and not olim. They came because of many prosaic reasons and not because of the Zionist ideology. So I do not think that because of the lack of the ideology, it was problematic for them to find job in Palestine, because it was absolutely a society of immigrants and not olim. Only few of them were very, very idealistic.
Okay, and that ends this round. Thank you all for participating.